Hi, this is Roman Budak. I'm going to explain how to use the FTDI cable, which is a USB to serial. I've been getting some questions on that. The idea is that I have this unit under test. That's some box or some device I've developed. It has a serial port, but I don't want to spend the money of putting a USB interface on this device, either for size or for cost reasons. But I do want to communicate to it with a PC. Well, your laptop computer no longer has serial ports on there. They're USB, maybe one or two ports on there, and that's it, no serial ports. So how do I convert it? So the way you convert it is that you use several different manufacturers of cables. The one that's the quote unquote gold standard is FTDI. They've been doing that for 15, 20 years, making a USB to serial. So what you do is plug in a USB port, your computer, whether it's Windows, Linux, or even Android, thinks that it is a serial port, and coming out of here, you would get your standard RS-232 port at TTL levels at 5 volts or 3.3 volt levels that you would use. So I'm going to use that cable to connect up to my unit. Now, when I do that out of my unit, I would then use from my computer, recognize it as a serial port and be able to watch or connect to it and see terminal emulation using a terminal emulator, and I'm going to use TeraTerm for this demo. So that's my device I have. I'm going to connect up with the USB port. For this particular case, if you're doing crystal tuning or looking at signals on an NXP board, they come out of PIO, so port pin IO 17, and that same pin can be used to measure clock signals. So one measurement method I might be able to use is a 10x probe, hook up to it, use a digital oscilloscope. In my particular case, then I have a USB cable to it and use the Android tablet to record the screen images or save the screen images directly onto a scope. If I want to use a function generator, well, then you can take a BNC to alligator. Signals are small enough that you could use that. You can't use the probe to here because it'll attenuate it too much. So a regular BNC to alligator to the same port pin, and then measure with the frequency counter. If your frequency counter has the ability to capture the data, well, you could certainly do that. I have two older ones that don't have that, so I have to use a camera. In this case, I use the camera function of the Android tablet to take a picture of the frequency counter. But for the majority of the cases, I'm trying to figure out how to use this UART cable to FTDI. And so the common one, and I just listed one manufacturer and distributor's part number. It's a fairly standard cable harness connection. Everybody, it's recognized in a lot of different literature, and it's going to be UART 0 on my device. So the pinouts and the colors again are pretty standard. It's on a 0.1 inch header. You may have a DB9 connector on here, or you have to go from this header to a DB9 connection. But your colors then would be orange, which is transmit on the PC side, goes to receive. This side is transmitting, and I want it to be received on my PC. So I go to yellow, which is receive data, pin 5 here. So those are the color schemes that I connect. If you had a hardware handshaking, you would also need clear to send and return to send, but most people don't do that anymore. They do software handshaking. 5 volts, sometimes you have to connect to power your board that's available. So this 5 volts will be connected to your board. If your board is self-powered, then you would leave this hanging off, but you would want to take your ground. I should have drawn on there. You'd want to take your ground and go to a header on the board because you don't know what these are. These are floating. If your laptop, especially if it's running off of a battery, that port will be isolated and will be floating. So the minimum 3 wires will be transmit, receive, and ground. And the cable powers itself. So molded in this case is an IC, and that's powered off your 5 volts coming off of your USB side of your computer. And so our boards have a FTDI connection on here, or you could jump around to this connector here, which is what I showed on the previous slide, and use an FTDI cable with overmolded with the IC inside of it. If you use this USB cable on the board, that is not a FTDI serial port. That's a different serial port, J-Link, or a different type of serial port from this IC. You want to use this port here to get your terminal emulation for this example for FTDI. If I connect it properly, I would then see feedback coming back from my board. And so now let me break away and show you how those connections are done. So the first thing to do is run Device Manager, and you want to see that there are no cables. So I will unplug my cable. So you could search in here if you're using Windows 11 or higher. You could use search under here, Device Manager, and it brings it up directly, so you don't have to search for it from the menus. The two things to look at is if it gets loaded properly, is you want to see under other devices, you shouldn't see anything that resembles a USB or serial port, and your ports, common serial. You want to write these down because these are always, in my case, I've got nothing plugged into the USB. These are COM ports, serial ports that are used by the motherboard. And if I plug in my FTDI cable, fortunately, I've already plugged it in once, so it loads the proper driver. But if it doesn't, FTDI, one of the reasons for using it is your Windows PC, your Mac, and others should recognize it and load the right driver into it. But if you don't, for some reason, does not load, it would show up under other devices, and then you know you have to load the driver. You should also hear the Windows attenuation or announcement function. So when you plug it in, there would be a beep beep that you plugged in a new USB device. A couple ways to check it. I can right click on here and look at the serial port to see what it's using. So FT is FTDI. That's the 230 chipset on there. And then I could look at driver, the driver details. So this loaded from Windows driver works fine. If I wanted to load a specific driver, here's where it tells you it's USB to serial. Generic Microsoft driver works. If I wanted to load a FTDI driver, I would go under here, update driver, and pick from my driver, search for, browse on my computer, whatever I wanted to load the driver. The nice part about FTDI is usually the generic Microsoft driver works fine with it. If you use some other cable, generic driver might not work, and you would have to hit the up driver and then browse your computer, find the hard drive that it's in, and or USB stick or whatever you had, and get the driver and load it in manually, and then it will copy into your Windows system. In this case, it's using the standard driver. Another way to check it is that there's a software called ZADIG, so diagnostic. You want to run that. Yes, I wanted to make changes. When I run this software, it will tell me all the serial ports and allow me to remove or add drivers. It's kind of funky because when you bring it up, it shows you nothing. You want to list all devices. And now you pull down what USB or other internal devices that are being used. So some of these are probably those COM 4.5, 14, 15 that are used internally. In this case, I want this basic UART one. And here I could see that it's using USB serial driver. And if I want to force it to use a new driver, I would hit replace driver. If I want to remove it, so because maybe I loaded a wrong driver in it or it's recognizing wrong, I could do it under the Device Manager screen, or this free utility sometimes works better at overriding a driver because I can pick a specific driver from the Windows system. So now that I've loaded all that, I would go ahead and load my terminal emulation, TerraTerm. Now it works with a TCP or a serial port. Remember what I said is that we're using a serial port driver emulation from USB. I can get that what port it is. It's COM16. It'll keep incrementing it every time you use the cable. Also, you have to be careful if you plug it into a different USB port on your laptop, it can increment it. So COM16 could be from the USB port on my right-hand side of the computer. If I plug it in on the left or back of my laptop, it could be a different COM port. So that shows up here, or when I go under serial, this will tell me all available COM ports. So I could see that I had a COM port 10, which was my J-Link, but that's not the one I want. I want my COM16, which is not showing up. So if I did have, I bet my, TerraTerm was open previously, so I'm going to close TerraTerm and open it up. Close. It was remembering when I had the other USB port that I was telling you sometimes on the board is other USB ports that are usable, and now shows my COM16. So I had to close it down because when I load TerraTerm, it looks at all the serial ports and it doesn't refresh them. So now here is my COM16. It matches what I'm was seeing up here, FTDI. So I'm going to load that. Okay. And now what you have to know is you have to know set up the serial port for what it is. So standard on NXP devices is that you would use baud rate. You would look that up in your documentation, might be 115 200K baud. 8 stop bits parity, you would look that up. That would be what the device that you're connecting to, what it should be, and you hit new setting. I don't have the right software loaded on my device, so it's not gonna, it's just showing up gibberish right now. But if I did have the right firmware loaded, I would start to see the setup screen for my device. You can also, with the terminal, set up the screen on what you want. You might want local echo so that you see things that as you type them on your keyboard, that they're how they're received. Otherwise, when I type on my keyboard here, I wouldn't see what I'm typing. So local echo allows me to see that. And then also a lot of times I like to see a okay, clear the screen here. I like to see inverted colors, so I would set up a inverted color, and I forget where that's at, but you can set up your colors to be inverted, to be white on black rather than black on, or a white background rather than a black background. And when you do that, you should be able to connect and see your device and be able to communicate with it. If there are any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, have good luck connecting to your system and using it.